Last episode I told you how that when I got back from from missionary conference at Prairie Valley Institute, I was moping around the house. My mom said, "Why don't you go back to school? Why don't you go back to Prairie Bible Institute?" And I had two major objections, two major barriers, two reasons why I couldn't go back. The first one was that Kenny's epilepsy, that I was needed at home for Kenny. Even though he hadn't had a seizure since I came home, but I was still giving him workouts every week. And then the second reason that was that, I don't know how it is now, but back then, the military, when you signed up for the military, you signed up for 6 years. If you volunteered, you signed up for 3 years of active duty and 3 years of inactive duty. If you were drafted, you were signed up for 2 years of active duty and 4 years of inactive duty. So as a result of my dependency discharge, I still had 4 years of inactive duty left to go. And I knew that if I left, that is, if I left home, if the problem with Kenny was cleared up in less than 2 years, I could be reactivated. So I told my mom, I said, "I can't go." And she said, "Well, just apply to Prairie for next year and see what God does." Well, okay, I could do that. So I did. I applied for Prairie Bible Institute to go back, and I was accepted, but I didn't think I was going to be able to go. And then in July, I got a 6-year discharge from the military. Now, I hadn't asked for it, I hadn't applied for it, I hadn't done anything. There was no logical reason why I would receive it. I still to this day do not understand why they sent it to me, except that it was God's will. And it was God's way of saying to me, "It's okay, you can go." And when I got that discharge, I knew that I would be going back to Prairie Bible Institute. But we still stepped up Kenny's test for his epilepsy, moved it up into August so that I could check. And if he failed that test, I would not be going. So we still had that barrier. When I was writing to Ada Hinkle, because her and Karen had promised to be my prayer warriors, but I didn't get any letters from Karen, so I just wrote to Ada Hinkle, and we were corresponding. So when I wrote to her and told her that I was going to be going back to Prairie Bible Institute, she asked if she could catch a ride. I said, "Sure, but you got to fly to Seattle-Tacoma Airport." So she did. She made arrangements to fly to Seattle-Tacoma Airport the day before I was going to leave, and I picked her up there. So when my mom took Kenny to the doctor for testing to see if his epilepsy was cleared up, to see what his status was, he passed with flying colors. Matter of fact, the doctor said he couldn't find any evidence that Kenny ever had epilepsy. And he said it's really good. The results are really good. But I think we should keep him on the phenobarbital just a little while longer just to be safe. And so he asked my mom, he says, "When was the last time you gave him phenobarbital?" And she said, "About 6 days ago." And he just went ballistic. He said, "Whoa, wait, no. You're supposed to be giving it to him 3 times a day." And my mom said, "Yeah." And the doctor said, "Okay, so when did he have his last seizure?" And she said, "Not since Dad died. He hasn't had a seizure since Dad died." And the doctor's going, "Okay, I guess I can't say much about that." And then she said, "Doc, I don't know if this will be of any help to anybody else, anywhere else. But what we have found is that as long as we give Kenny a complete exercise, that is exhausting exercise, at least once a week, we make sure that he plays until he is just exhausted at least once a week. And we found that if we did that, he doesn't get a seizure. It's when he becomes quiet, when he stops exercising, when he stops moving around, that he is in danger of getting a seizure." So she explained that to him and told him, she said, "Now I have been renewing the prescriptions on schedule because I didn't know anything about what the shelf life of the medicine was. So I've just renewed it on a regular basis. And whenever it came due, she would throw away the old and renew it with new." So Yeah, I made arrangements to go back to Prairie Bible Institute. Ada Hinkle came the night before, and I went over to Seattle Tacoma Airport, picked her up, and I think it was late afternoon, and she stayed at our place that night. And early the next morning, her and I took off for Prairie Bible Institute. Now, we made arrangements at Prairie so that when we got there late at night, we'd still have rooms. We'd have dorm rooms. They told us we could pick up our dorm room keys at the switchboard. So we pulled in like, 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, and we went to the switchboard, which is open 24 hours a day, 24/7, and we got our keys, and I took her over to her room. She unloaded, took her stuff into her room, and I unloaded, took my stuff into my room. When I got over to JK dorm, and we were in our rooms. We were back on campus, moved in. I had a roommate, his name was John, and he had a really good friend, Bill. The two of them are really good buddies. John was a total stranger to me when I met him, but we shared a room, and it was kind of strange, really, being in my junior year, not knowing anybody. I mean, most of the juniors all knew each other because they'd been going to school at Prairie for 2 years already. But all the people that I knew when I was going my freshman and sophomore year were gone, except for the ones that stayed on staff. There were a couple, 3 or 4 that stayed on staff, but they were all gone. One thing I did notice that was amazing to me was before I left 3 years ago, L.E. Maxwell and the school asked the students to write a letter to L.E. Maxwell telling them what we thought of the social regulations and any improvements we thought could be made to them. Well, I wrote a fairly good-sized, fairly lengthy letter to L.E. Maxwell basically saying that I agreed with the social regulations from the perspective of preparing students for the mission field, because in a lot of societies, men or women do not have free exchange like they do in the United States. So it was good discipline. But then I suggested also that there should be some provision made for guys and girls to get to know each other in their junior and definitely in their senior year. Supervised dating or some kind or something. So it was really interesting to me when I talked to the dean, Mr. Jansen, that Prairie had changed the social regulations, and they basically had incorporated pretty much all the recommendations that I made. They had it so there was no talking for your freshman and sophomore year, and in the junior year there was limited talking, and in the senior year, every Friday night after the missionary service, the mission service, the seniors, both guys and girls, could stay in the tabernacle and talk with each other, fellowship with each other, all they wanted. It was supervised by staff members, so there was always nothing going to go on there that shouldn't. But it was free for them to get to know each other, and that was really interesting. Now, along the same line, a couple of freshmen were just complaining about the social regulations. They were saying, "Oh, these are so old. Prairie will never change." And I said, "Excuse me, hello, that is wrong. You are totally wrong." I said, first of all, they do make sense if you're going to the mission field, and second of all, they have changed them. And I told them about the request for us for feedback on the social regulations, and that I said, basically, Prairie's made all the changes I suggested. And it was not like this 3 years ago when I was here. So no, don't tell me they'll never change, because they have changed. They have changed quite a bit. And I kind of called them to task for prejudging and assuming Prairie Bible Institute would never change. Then the other thing that I had happen was, of course, I'm a stranger, like I said, and I'm in the Romans class, which is all juniors. Pretty much all juniors is a Bible class, and the juniors are the ones that are taking it. And we're in Romans chapter 3, or was it 2? Anyway, we're in Romans, and Paul Maxwell, that's L.E. Maxwell's son, brought up the question, well, if a person in a foreign land where the gospel is not gone, a man that has never heard the gospel, or a person that has never heard the gospel, if they live according to and obey their conscience, they do everything as they believe they should, they live a good life, can they get to heaven? And the class started debating on it for, I must have gone for about 20 minutes. And finally I kind of had my fill. And so I stood up, and when Paul Maxwell acknowledged me and I got my turn, I proceeded to read Romans chapter 3 verses 5 through 12, where Paul says, there is none righteous, no, not one. There's none that seeks God. And I said to the class, I said, the possibility you are debating, the Bible says will and can never happen. I said, according to the Bible, we are their only hope. Taking the gospel to them is their only hope. Nobody lives a perfect life, not even according to their own conscience. And then I sat down. And Paul Maxwell said, well, there you have it, folks. We debate for 20, 30 minutes here, and one man stands up and reads the Bible and puts everything in place. And after that, I became pretty notorious among the juniors as the guy who put the Romans class in their place. And I'm not sure it was a good thing, but anyway, people knew who I was. Oh yeah, you're the guy. So that was kind of strange. Not exactly the way I wanted to get known, though. I had John was my roommate, and as I said earlier, and his best friend Bill was always wanting to pull practical jokes on him, and he would do things like short sheet the bed and all kinds of different things. He was always thinking up something new to do to John. I would object, and Bill would say to me, oh, John's going to love it. He likes this kind of stuff. He loves this. He loves it. He's going to laugh, and he's going to smile. He's going to just love it. And so I cooperated, and I went along with it. And sure enough, John laughed and smiled and said, oh, you guys, and I thought, okay, well, I guess he does like it. And then when I came back at the end of my Christmas break, I had a new roommate. Dave, I was assigned to a new room and had to move all my stuff over into a different room, and I had a new roommate named Dave. And when I turned to John and I said, why? He said, you're always pulling those jokes on me. And I said, Bill said you loved it. You always laughed. I didn't know. How could I know? I didn't know you didn't like it. If you told me you didn't like it, I would have stopped him. I wouldn't have cooperated with him if I thought you didn't like it. But I thought he liked it. So I learned then, don't assume. Find out. Check. I was so embarrassed. It was so sad because John and I got along pretty good otherwise. And I really liked having him as a roommate, but there was no way to turn it back. There was no way to go back. Now my new roommate, Dave, he was a senior. And I really liked having him as a roommate too. Now he was the guy, Dave would have me, he'd turn his back. And he'd turn around so he couldn't see it, because he said, I don't want to see where you are in the Bible. And then he'd have me take the Bible and open it up and just read. And I'd start into reading, and as I read, he would tell me where I was in the Bible. And it was amazing, because he could do it just time after time after time. It didn't matter if I picked Old Testament or New Testament, he could pick it out. And I said to him one day, I said, so how do you do this? He said, well, you know what the topic is. There's only so many places in the Bible where that topic is covered. And he says, the writing is like Paul. It's the way Paul writes. So it had to be Romans chapter 6. Or it had to be Romans chapter 12 or whatever it was. So he said, you can figure out where it is by just knowing what topics are covered where in the Bible. And I really learned a lot from him that semester. To be able to say to people, oh, that's Romans chapter 6, or oh, that's or 1 Corinthians chapter 13, or, Romans chapter 14 covers that. And it was interesting. It's really made a big difference in my life and my ministry, because I learned to categorize whole passages instead of do verses. Instead of chopping the Bible up into a bunch of little phrases, take it by paragraphs. And so Dave and I got along real good. But come toward the end of my junior year, I was talking with Bill one day, and we were talking about earning money or needing to earn money in order to come back to school, which I did. I needed to earn money that summer. I was not going to be able to go on a missions thing like I did my freshman year. And I knew that I had to go earn money, and I wasn't sure where I could do that. And Bill said, oh, why don't you come home with me? There's lots of opportunities in Washington, D.C. to earn money in the summer. So yeah, you come home with me, you'll get a job, and you'll be able to earn all the money you need. And I said, okay, that works. Yeah, we'll do that. So at the end of the school year, I went home, I packed up everything I needed for the summer, and I headed for Washington, D.C. And when I got there to Bill's home in Falls Church, that's just outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia, I started looking for a job. Now it was interesting what God did. I'm out looking for a job, and I'm praying for a job because I really need one. And I saw this one ad in the paper. It was for a TV repairman. So I went and I applied for the job, and the guy gave me a bunch of questions, for troubleshooting type questions, and I answered them. And afterwards he says, I really like you. You're really good, and you seem to know your stuff. He said, but this job is not very good pay, and it's not a lot of hours, and it's mostly just handing out flyers. It's not what you're looking for. But I'll tell you what I can do. I'll give you a lead to a job, to a real job. And it's just opened up. It's not even in the newspapers. It's not even being advertised yet. But I know of this job, and I'll give you a lead. And he said, you call up Virginia Electronics Company, and he said, you tell them you're applying for the new electronics technician job, and you should get first shot at it because it's not been published. So I did. He gave me the phone number. I went home and I called up Virginia Electronics Company, and I said, I'm applying for the new electronics technician position. And they said, don't have one. I'm sorry, we don't have any open positions at this time. And I said, wait a minute, are you sure? Because I got it from a very reliable source that you had a job that just opened up for an electronics technician. And the lady, the telephone, the secretary on the telephone said, well, just a minute, I'll check. So she went to the head of the assembly line and asked him if he had a position, and apparently he did, because she came back to the phone and said, yeah, I got one if you want to come down and fill out an application. I said, I'll be right there. So I went straight down there, filled out their application. She took me back, and I interviewed with the supervisor of the assembly line, and I was hired that day, started the next day. It was cool. I had a job, and just that quickly, and God provided. God provided me with a job. I can only say God provided because it wasn't even in the papers. That connection was not one that I could have ever made on my own. Now, most of the people, most of the women that are on the assembly line, they spoke Spanish. And they were all fluent in English. Everybody had to be able to read English because all the instructions were in English. And it turned out that the electronics technician job was actually being supervisor of the assembly of the components. And the other thing is that the electronics technician builds the model and writes up the instructions on how they should make it, on what to do, what to put first, what to put last, so that it gets assembled correctly. And so I write up the instructions, change any blueprint mistakes that need to be fixed, and send back to drafting, provide all the supplies for the ladies that need supplies when they need whatever they need. I make sure that they have it, and I give them everything they need. One afternoon while I was there, this guy, maintenance guy, came to me, and his name was Ken. Now, it didn't matter how much I explained to them that I was a Bible school student, not a seminary student. And the conversation always ended with, "So that's a lot like seminary, isn't it?" And so my nickname, or identification, whatever you want to call it, all the people on the assembly line knew me as the seminary student. So this guy by the name of Ken came to me and said, "Are you the seminary student?" And I said, "Well, actually it's a Bible school student, but yeah. Everybody calls me a seminary student." And he said, "What do you think about Vietnam?" Now, I could have discussed the pros and cons of Vietnam with him, and him and I could have either agreed or disagreed with Vietnam, and absolutely nothing would be accomplished. So I chose a different path. I decided to explain to him instead the sinful nature of man. I used the 4 spiritual laws. I said, "Ken, you know, man is basically egocentric. That is, they're about self. They're selfish. And when you have 2 people that are self-centered and they get involved and then they have overlap and conflicting interest, then they fight over those conflicts. They fight over their interest. They fight for their interest. And when you have a nation full of egocentric people, you're going to have an egocentric nation. And when 2 nations fight over conflict and interest, that's called war." And he looked at me and he said, "I have sin." I said, "That's right. I know you have sin. But you know, God has provided for your sin. Jesus Christ." Second law and the third law of the spiritual laws is that Jesus Christ is God's only provision for your sin. Jesus came and died on the cross to pay the penalty for your sin so that you can have your sins forgiven and you can go to heaven. If you ask him, if you accept what he did as sufficient, and you ask him to come into your life to forgive your sin and be Lord of your life, you can be saved. And then I took him to the 4th law that says you have to do it by personal invitation. Jesus doesn't just come in. He doesn't come in unless you ask him. You have to ask him. And he looked at me and said, "You know, I kind of had this discussion with my brother, but what he said didn't make sense, but what you're saying makes sense." I said, "Well, who's your brother? What church does he go to?" And he said, "He's Mormon." I said, "Oh, well, that's why." I said, "He added other things to the Bible. I'm just giving you the story as the Bible tells it." And he goes, "Oh, okay. Well, I'll have to think about that." So when I went back to church that Wednesday night, prayer meeting, I got up and I asked them to pray for Ken because he had a decision to make. And I asked them to pray that he would decide to follow Jesus. One of the gals there that was also from Prairie Bible Institute in the church, she was in the class in the prayer meeting when I gave it. She came to me after prayer meeting. She said, "Bob, it's not fair." I said, "What's not fair?" She said, "You have been here for what? 2 months? A month? Not even a month. You've been here for a month, and you've already had an opportunity to share Christ at work. And I've been at my job for 3 years, 3 summers running." And she says, "I haven't had a chance to share Christ yet, after 3 years of being at my job." And I looked and I said, "Betty, the barrier is not in your job. The barrier is in your heart." I said, "When you get to the point where you see Jesus as just as valid a topic of conversation as the weather. If you can talk about the weather, you can talk about Jesus. If you shouldn't be talking about the weather, then you shouldn't be talking about Jesus either." I said, when you get to that point, when you come to the point where you see Jesus as a valid topic, then you will have opportunities to share the gospel. You know, it was interesting to me because it's like the next weekend we went to the beach. All the college age group from the church went to the beach, and Betty got, 4 opportunities to witness with various people. She was just witnessing everybody she met because she now took Jesus as a valid topic of conversation. If she could talk about the weather, she could talk about Jesus. And she just started sharing the gospel with everybody she knew and everybody she met. One afternoon, one evening, I went to the coffee house. Back in those days, they were doing coffee houses that were put together specifically for sharing the gospel. And I went to the coffee house just to see what it was like. And I went there and I sat in on it and shared the gospel with somebody I could. And on my way home, I saw a motorist pulled over by the monument, Washington Monument, and he was pulled off the road, had his dome light on, obviously studying a map. So I pulled over behind him and I asked him if I could help him, and he said, well, I'm lost. I went to the monument and now I can't find my way back. So I took his map and I showed him where he needed to go. And then I said, have you considered you might be lost in more than just where to go next? Do you know how to get to heaven? Or are you lost there too? And I shared the gospel with him. And he was really interested, but he needed time to think about it. And he wouldn't make the decision that night. So we traded addresses. And he said he'd write to me if he received Christ and tell me about it. I said that would be great. And then I told him, I'll write to you if I have anything more. So we traded addresses. And I went on through, I had many things that summer. I'll tell you some more of them next time. God did some wonderful stuff that summer. As he likes to do wonderful stuff, you know. Next time, I'll tell you the rest of the summer.